you for joining us today. I'm Nia Evans from the National Women's Law Center, and I am the organizer of today's webinar, Let Her Learn, How to Push Discriminatory Discipline Policies Out of Schools. I have just a few technical notes to share before we begin the presentation. All lines will be on mute during today's webinar. We will be taking questions from our experts once they're finished, but we encourage you to submit questions throughout the webinar. You can submit a question by typing it into the designated area on your control panel and hitting send. We will be recording today's webinar, and you will receive a link to a recording of the presentation as well as a link to the PowerPoint slides within the next few days. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Adaku Kenyatta Crawford, our Counsel for Education at the National Women's Law Center. Adaku, take it away.
Thank you, Nia. So let's go to the first slide. My name is Adaku Kenyatta Crawford, and I am counsel here, focusing on education issues at the National Women's Law Center. And one thing that we hope you learn a lot from this webinar, but most importantly, we hope that you walk away from this training knowing a little bit more about school pushout and information about how you can make change in your school or community. We are joined by Zakiya Sankara-Jabbar from Dignity in Schools campaign, and she's going to share some notes from the field as an advocate, but also a parent advocate. But first, we want to talk about our Let Her Learn campaign and what the National Women's Law Center is doing to shine light and help folks identify unfair discipline policies in their schools. So about Let Her Learn, we started this campaign because we were finding some really disturbing stats about school pushout and the school-to-prison pipeline, which has focused mostly on Black boys, but we also want to highlight that this is something that disproportionately affects Black girls as well. So for example, Black girls are 5.5 times more likely to be suspended from school as white girls. And Black girls are more likely than any other race or gender to be suspended more than once. So that includes Black boys. So while Black boys are more likely to get one suspension, Black girls are more likely to get multiple suspensions. So you really need to look at school pushout using a race and gender lens. And one thing we also highlight in our materials is that Native American girls are also disproportionately affected by unfair discipline. So American Indian girls are 3 times more likely to be suspended as white girls, and Latina girls are 1.6 times more likely to be suspended. And one thing I want to highlight is that these uneven rates of discipline are not because of more frequent or serious misbehavior. And so to shine a light on this issue, we've created the Let Her Learn campaign. And the goal is to create change that we want to see in schools to stop unfair discipline and other policies that push girls out of school. And so there are 2 strategies to the campaign. The first one is to educate the public on race and sex-based barriers, such as unfair discipline. And the first thing that we did for that first strategy was release a video in January that's been viewed more than 6.5 million times on Facebook. And we think part of the reason why it's gone viral is because this is something that's resonated with folks. Maybe they knew that this was happening in their schools, and it's amplifying that and giving a light to it. And then there are also people who maybe aren't as familiar with school pushout, but they felt like it was very unfair and it shined a light on an issue that they didn't know about. So basically it amplified the voices and experience of Black girls and shed light on things that maybe people did or did not know was happening, but they knew was unjust or wrong. And the second part of Let Her Learn is giving advocates tools that they can use to make change in their communities. So this webinar is one of those tools, but also our toolkit that we released late last year to help folks identify unfair discipline policies in their school is another. Next slide. So before we get into our toolkit and how folks can use it, I do want to outline that there are some federal laws that protect students already. So Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 protects students based on race, color, and country of origin. So that includes students of color, Black, Latina, Native American, Asian, Pacific Islander students, and students from immigrant families, because that falls under country of origin discrimination. And basically, Title VI says that they must have equal access to school. If you fall into, you can't be discriminated in school based on race, color, and country of origin. Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972 protects students based on sex and gender. And so this includes cisgender students as well as transgender students, as well as students who don't conform to one gender or don't conform to sex stereotypes. And Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504, the Rehabilitation Act, protects students based on disability. And this isn't just mental disabilities or physical disabilities, but all disabilities. You cannot be discriminated against in school if you have a disability, and this law protects from that. And these are great laws, but the problem is that case law is not fully developed under these laws, which means that there's a whole range of cases that may be discriminatory, but it just hasn't been brought before court. And so it's a little bit less defined. And so part of another reason why we released the toolkit and why we are pushing this campaign is that the change really needs to start at the grassroots level. We need advocates such as yourself to start raising these issues in schools with your principal or with your school board, so that, you know, once the issue becomes more in the public consciousness, and we can more fully develop a record to bring cases and to try and create some of that case law that identifies discriminatory discipline under any one of these federal civil rights laws. Next slide. And so let's talk about our toolkit, which we released in December of last year. So this toolkit you can download from nwlc.org/letherlearn, and it will help you identify biased policies and practices in your school or district. And the toolkit goes through the most common race and sex-based policies, and we'll go through those as well on this webinar. And those three policies are dress code infractions, defiant / insubordination, what I like to call attitude violations, and then also sex codes. So we are going to go through those three policies that disproportionately affect girls of color. Next slide. So dress codes. And we have this sample policy or illustration kind of highlighting the ways in which dress code disproportionately affect girls. You'll notice that in an entire 3 lines of this illustration are typically, you know, clothing worn by girls. So that's usually why this disproportionately affects girls more than boys. So there's usually more restriction for girls. And we see these are as attempts to police girls' bodies. And one of the problems is it targets girls who are curvier or more developed, which tends to be girls of color. And it's problematic because, you know, I know when I was, you know, a teenage girl and my body was developing, I didn't want anyone to call attention to the fact that, you know, my boobs were bigger suddenly. And it was a really big point of insecurity to begin with. And then when the teacher would single you out in class and say, you know, yeah, I can see this part of your body, it's embarrassing, and it really calls attention to girls and makes them feel targeted and makes them feel unwelcome in school. Another thing I want to point out, especially with the last line of this illustration, is that it can also target clothing and styles worn by certain races. So, you know, saggy pants, do-rags. You know, we've heard stories about like entire school districts that have banned like entire article of clothing that are usually worn by students of color. So last year there was a school in Pennsylvania that outlawed hoodies, and so they suspended 40 students within the first week of class for wearing hoodies. We heard stories about schools that ban natural hairstyles or African prints, and those are clearly racially targeted towards Black girls and boys. And so there's really huge problems with those that may implicate race and sex stereotypes. Next slide. So we are going to judge a dress code policy using our toolkit. So the policy on the left is an actual school policy from a school district which we filed a complaint against in Georgia. The complaint was related to discrimination for a pregnant and parenting student, but in looking at their other handbook policies, we saw that there are possibly some other issues. And this is what you can do with the checklist. So download the checklist and then compare it to the school policy that in your school. So on the right, you just go through the checklist for hair and dress codes. So the first question is your policy super strict? For example, does it require skirts to be fingertip length, or does it ban entire articles of clothing? Well, if you look at the dress code policy on the left, it does. So that says straps must be a minimum of 3 inches to width. That's kind of similar to fingertip length. Strapless garments are prohibited in total. Low-cut necklines are prohibited in total. So it's a little strict. So I would check mark that box for that. What about rules? Are they sex specific? And if so, are there more rules for girls than boys? And do they lack accommodations for gender non-conforming students? So you'll note that in this policy, they don't say girls must wear X and boys must wear Y. But you do see that a lot of the policies are, clothing that would more likely be worn by girls, such as strapless garments or backless garments. And we didn't include this because there's only so much you can include on a slide, but they also prohibited stilettos. So it's very clear from this that, girls have more restrictions than boys. So I would also check that box. Moving on to the next box, does your school's policy target hairstyles or clothing common to certain racial, ethnic, or religious groups? Well, right off the bat, it says no do-rags, no bandanas, no headbands, which I think is really weird. But clearly, bandanas and do-rags are more likely to be worn by Black students. And also the grills not being able to be worn on any time on campus. That's clearly something that Black students would more likely wear. So I would check that box. And then can students be suspended or pulled out of class for not following the dress code? So this policy doesn't say that, and so I wouldn't check that box. Does your school use coded language to justify the dress code? For instance, does it call certain clothing ladylike, or say hairstyles aren't too neat? So the very first sentence of the dress code is students shall be clean, neat, and dressed in a manner conducive to academic achievement. So I don't have a problem with dressed in a manner that's conducive to academic achievement, but what does clean and neatness mean? Is an afro clean and neat? So I would that's a little red flag. So one thing I want to say is that a red flag so if that's the only thing that's checked, the policy is probably fine. But if it's combined with other things that are, racially or sexually targeted, it should raise a flag. And finally, does your school claim it needs the dress code to keep boys from being distracted from girls? So this policy didn't say that, but we have seen policies where it says ladies can't be a distraction to boys. And that is a clear red flag, because how do you determine whether or not a girl is a distraction to a boy? And honestly, we should be teaching boys to be able to concentrate and treat all women with respect regardless of what they're wearing. So that's a way to judge a dress code policy. Can you go to the next slide? The next set of policies that we are going to look at is Defiant, which can also be insubordination, or what I like to call attitude violations, and sex codes. So girls of color, especially Black girls, are disciplined for subjective offenses like insubordination. And a lot of times we see that this kind of discipline is informed by sex and race stereotypes. So the angry Black woman stereotype, the sassy neck-rolling Black girl, these kind of stereotypes don't conform with traditional, quote-unquote, notions of femininity, such as being passive or quiet. And so educators may feel like Black girls are in need of greater social correction because they're not conforming to these stereotypes of what is proper feminine behavior. And we see that the way that they choose to try and quote unquote correct this behavior is through suspensions under defiance or insubordination. So what's really dangerous about this is that what someone is calling attitude or defiance may be explained by other factors. So one thing that we've seen, or an example of this that was in the news, was the incident in Spring Valley where the police officer flipped a girl out of her desk. Well, what came out later was, and the police officer was called in because she was on her cell phone and wouldn't put it away and then wouldn't leave. And what came out afterwards was that that girl had just lost her mother and had been placed in foster care. And instead of like having a ear, someone to listen and a shoulder to lean on, she was assaulted. And so this shows why, like, just suspending or disciplining quote unquote attitude violations is so dangerous, because you're not getting to the heart of the issue. And you're forgetting that these are kids, teenagers who are sassy anyway, and really missing an opportunity to show some kind of social emotional support. And so especially if there are suspensions for minor infractions for defiance or insubordination, that should be a huge red flag, because as we said, you know, attitude can be something else. It doesn't have to be, you know, just being defiant. There should be another step before suspensions. So moving on to sex codes. The way we see this usually come up, and this actually is a Title IX violation, is that a girl will report that they were sexually assaulted against their consent, like subject to like sexual activity against their consent. And they report it, and the assailant denies it, and the school punishes the girl because she admitted to having sex against her will. And we usually see these in indecency policies that say no lewd behavior. And it really is terrible because it dissuades victims from coming forward and reporting a sexual assault. And it also puts the rest of the school at risk, because you're not punishing the assailant or even investigating the assailant. You're just punishing victims who come forward. Schools have obligations under Title IX to address assaults when it creates a hostile environment in school, and they also have an obligation not to retaliate against someone for filing a complaint. So suspending a student who complains about sexual assault is clearly retaliation, and this is one of the few areas where the case law has developed enough that we can bring claims against schools for acting in this manner. Next slide. So let's judge defiance and sex code policy. So again, this policy is from that same school district, which I should have rearranged this slide a little bit better. But let's look at the Let Her Learn checklist for under sexual conduct policies. Can students be punished for sexual conduct even if they did not consent? So Rule 9 has the indecency policy, and it says generally students shall not perform any lewd acts or sexual intercourse. But the action to be taken, it says the penalty may range from short-term suspension to long-term suspension. And sexual intercourse or other sexual misconduct will result in being referred to a disciplinary tribunal. So any kind of sexual behavior results in suspension. And so that would be an X mark for that first box. And that's all it says about the indecency policy. So this red flag would make me wonder, well, what if someone complains about sexual assault? It's not very clear here. And these are the type of policies we've seen where students are retaliated against for reporting a sexual assault. So the way to improve this policy would be to make clear that students who report a sexual assault will not be subject to the indecency policy. And then the next question is, does your school punish students for behavior revealed when they're reporting harassment or assault? So for example, if a student says they were assaulted while they were passed out, will a school punish the student for drinking? This policy didn't necessarily say that, and very few policies will. What we see is this is more so something that comes up in practice rather than in written policies. Moving on to the next part of the checklist, attitude violations. So does the policy punish students for vague attitude violations such as talking back or defiance? That actually should be check marked because it's a little vague, disregarding directions or commands, deliberate defiance of authority. It says something about students immediately complying with reasonable directions or commands of teachers. It's just a little too vague. So what if they didn't hear them, or how do you judge immediate compliance, and how do you judge what's reasonable directions or commands? So that's kind of like an iffy one. I know I didn't check it, but I would circle that and maybe come back. The next question, can students be suspended or moved from school for these attitude violations? Well, in the actions to be taken, it says penalty is 2 days out of school suspension for insubordination. So again, this is really dangerous because you don't know why someone is not immediately complying. Maybe they didn't hear. Maybe they're going through some things. The fact that you would jump to 2 days out of school suspension is a big red flag. And we didn't go through this that much, but police presence, that's something you should also check out in the school. It's not usually in the sample policy or in the student handbook, but you should also note whether or not police officers are involved in disciplinary matters, and if they can handcuff students or use physical restraints. That might be a violation if the student has a disability and an IEP, as well as if you notice that certain students of certain ethnicities or races are disproportionately arrested by police. Next slide. So what do you do if you find any of these red flags? Well, first, one thing that I advise you to do right after you get off this, or maybe even during, no, right after you get off this webinar, is to grab a copy of your school's handbook and compare it to the Let Her Learn toolkit and see whether or not there are red flags. So hard copies of the student handbook are usually handed out at the beginning of the school year, but you can even just Google your school's policy and use Google Maryville High School, handbook, and you can usually find a policy online if you don't have a hard copy. And if you've identified policies that raise red flags, take the checklist to your principal and ask them what they are going to do so that these policies raise some concerns, and ask them if they can kind of talk through and change any of these policies. And even if you don't ID any red flags from the student handbook, you should go a little bit further. A lot of times the policies don't match the practices. So again, that the handbook that we used and the complaint that we brought against the school district in Georgia, their policies for pregnant and parenting students were fine on paper, but then when you actually talk to teachers and when you actually talk to students, we found out that they weren't following their own policies. So if they look good on paper, go a little bit deeper, talk to parents, talk to students, talk to teachers, figure out if they are following their policies. And finally, what does the data say? School districts are required to collect data on the number of disciplinary measures taken against students, number of suspensions, expulsions, arrests, referrals to law enforcement. Ask them for that information, and you can even look it up online at the Civil Rights Data Collection. And Let Her Learn, our toolkit, has some recommendations for what you can do next to kind of start to change policies. But we're so lucky and happy to have someone who is actually doing this work and has done this work, Zakia Sankara-Jabbar. And I'm going to hand it over to her so she can share some notes from the field as a parent advocate who is already making changes in her school district. Zakia?
Hi, can everyone hear me? Hope so. Okay, great. I just wanted to make sure. So as Adaku said, I'm Zakia Sankara-Jabbar. I am now the National Field Organizer for the Dignity in Schools campaign. However, I co-founded Racial Justice Now, which is based in Dayton, Ohio, which was led by me as a parent, thrust into this work because of school push-out. At that time, it happened to be my son, and now I actually have a daughter. And so she's coming into the preschool age, which at the time I was going through that, like I said, with my son. So I want to just walk through how, as a parent, you can be the best advocate for your child, and some tips that I know that's tried and true that will work. So we can go to the next slide. So one of the things that I had to figure out, right, in organizing even with other parents and lifting up, you know, sort of out of the shadows, sort of these things that are happening in schools. One of the things that I found out in organizing is that this can be a source of shame for many parents, especially Black parents, poor and working class Black parents, Black women in particular, leading the household and raising their children. Many times those stereotypes about even being a single Black mother are hurled not just on our children, but also on the parents. And so it took a lot of work to like bring that out of parents and to help them work through not being ashamed, and to actually let them know that they have some agency, they actually have rights when it comes to what happens in school with their children. And so the first thing that we started to do, and that I identified that was really important, is not to start off with an adversarial relationship, right, with the educator. That it was, you know, upon us as parents to sort of reach out, try to build a relationship with your children's teacher. The earlier the better. Talk a little bit about your child to the teacher, let them know what they can expect. Also let them know that you'll be available even if you're not able to come up to the school for visits all the time. There's all kinds of ways to communicate now through email. Obviously you can always do pop-ups at the school and other media platforms, such as many teachers I know here in Dayton, they're using something called Class Dojo. That's a media platform that educators are using to communicate with parents about your children. And another really important thing that I think that needs to happen really early is to become familiar with your school district student code of conduct, right? So everything that Adaku was talking about, you know, in the handbook, in the student code of conduct, is actually policy set by the school district. Most school districts have what's called a policy committee. Many of those policies are set based on state law and even federal law. And so depending on how your school district is interpreting the law will depend on what's in that particular student code of conduct. So for example, here in Ohio, we have a law that says we have a zero tolerance law, but it's a very vague law, right? One of the things that we found out, you know, in organizing is that in the Ohio revised code, right, it doesn't explicitly say under Ohio zero tolerance law that because you have zero tolerance, you have to suspend and expel. So the law doesn't prescribe what districts should do. Many districts have decided, however, that zero tolerance means the most punitive forms of discipline. And so as parents, it's really good to partner with other advocates, legal and policy organizations, and other parents to help work through you know, how to get policy changes at your local level. And so that's something that's extremely important. And another thing is, and I've had to do this in organizing with parents, is choose your child first. I know that many of us grew up in an era where the adults, you know, was always right. I know that I did. I grew up in the South. And whatever the teacher said, you know, that was, you know, law, right? There was really no agency given to the child. There was really no agency, you know, given, and no leverage, or, you know, really no credence at all really given to the child and what happens. But unfortunately, because of, you know, we have this legacy of institutional and systemic racism in this country, that those kinds of things do spill over into all institutions, unfortunately, including education. maybe even more pronounced in schools, as we can see and while we're having this webinar, right? We are our child's best advocate, right? They really don't have a lot of agency at all, and so your child is really depending on you to stand up for them if there's something that's not happening right at the school. So that's extremely important. I know that it can be tricky, especially when you're dealing with really small children, and that part can be tricky, but just use your intuition. You know your child better than anybody else, right? Do some investigations. We can go to the next slide. And so the investigation part, right? One of the things that I've experienced with, with my children is that the adult or the teacher will say, oh, well, such and such had an issue today, and so they're going to get detention. That's literally like all the information that they'll give you. They'll tell you what the infraction is, and this is going to be the result. Ask questions. Ask probing questions. Always ask, well, what happened before that, right? What was the context and what happened? Usually you'll get a response, and then you can sometimes get to the bottom of it, and even as a parent, you have a right to even make suggestions and say, well, how about we not do a detention? It sounds like, if there's a peer-to-peer conflict, if there was, pushing and shoving, there was harsh language, exchange between the children, we feel like, the best way to handle that is to have a restorative justice circle, right? Now, most teachers and educators are probably going to be shocked, right, that, who do you think you are as a parent, to make a suggestion? This is how, we do things. That's unfortunately how schooling happens, for the majority of African-American parents and our children, unfortunately. But you don't have to accept that. You do, again, have a right to make suggestions. If you don't feel like your suggestions or, that your voice is not being heard at the school level, you have every right to move up the chain of command. In the state of Ohio, we have local control. We still have locally elected school boards. Get familiar with that, right? Go to your local school board meeting, request meetings with the superintendent, request meetings, with whoever her associates are. You can always move up the chain of command. And I know that this can sound very overwhelming, but the unfortunate thing is that we really do, as parents, especially parents of color, Black parents, we have to prioritize our children in the context of education. The data is just showing us that, African American children in particular are disproportionately, punitively disciplined in schooling all across this country. I mean, it's not just one place, it's really everywhere. So it's an epidemic, and so we as parents, have to make that priority and really step up our advocacy efforts for our children to make sure that they have an opportunity for quality education. This is really important. Never attend a meeting at the school alone. Now, I know that sometimes that can be difficult to get someone to go with you, but as a general rule, never attend the meeting alone. It's really unfortunate. I'm doing my best not to, paint schools as just, these horrible places for kids, but it can be. That's just the reality, unfortunately. All schools are not like that. There are some great educators, great principals, everywhere, but, there's this other side that just doesn't get talked about as much. The reason why you don't want to go to a meeting alone is because there's a power dynamic that's at place. You as a parent sitting in front of a teacher, probably sitting there with a principal, and God knows whoever else. Usually when you're being called in for meetings, especially around an IEP meeting or a disciplinary meeting, they will have at least 3 or 4 people in the meeting with you. And unfortunately, sometimes the school will use that as intimidation for parents. we've seen that happen several times. Our organization has several parents who've been trained up to attend meetings with parents, specifically as advocates. And one of the things in the job for the person that's attending the meeting with you is to be a witness, basically, to observe, to take notes, because if there's ever any questions, if there's ever anything you need to go back on, the school and the teachers and whoever else was in the meeting that's on the school side, right, can't all of a sudden get amnesia and say, no, this didn't happen, because you also have someone there with you as well. So that's why that piece is very important. And I just think too, parents need support as well. We don't have all the answers. Many parents don't even know all the laws and policies that govern education. Most of us don't know that. It took me years to figure out a lot of stuff, and I'm still figuring it out. So that's another reason why it's just really good to make sure you have another adult with you. And we can go to the next slide. And really quickly, too, if you're not able to meet in person with a teacher or principal, communication by email is also the best way. I mean, phone calls are fine, but I think, keeping a record of what the conversation has been about is very important. So emails are legal documents. When you're emailing back and forth, with a teacher or, with a principal, that's your documentation that they have been notified of something, that you have raised a concern about something. That's just your documentation that there has been open communication, and if something is not changing, if something, is not working out, for you or your child, that's your documentation that you have been pushing or asking, for these supports and asking for, particular changes. I do want to warn, and this is something that I experienced as a parent, you really do have to use your intuition and feel your way through this, right? I know that can sound, very weird, but what I mean is that when you begin to become an advocate based on the information that I'm sharing with you, most school districts, if they're dealing with majority Black and brown communities, especially in urban areas, low wealth areas, they are not going to be used to parents having that level of advocacy skills. And so there may be some, and I just want to be honest with people on here, there may be some retaliatory things that will happen to you as a parent. I experienced that, when my son was eventually expelled from a preschool, and I believe it was because I stood up and I advocated and I asked questions and I just didn't accept their narrative, right, about him, and I questioned their environment, right? What nerve, that I have, as a parent to stick up for my kid and question, sort of their environment and the teacher's own biases and all of those different things. So that can also, be an issue, and I don't think, is lifted up very much. So what is described mostly sometimes as African American parents not wanting to be involved, or, this high level of apathy, can actually be because they have experienced being retaliated against, and sometimes they feel like maybe doing nothing is best so that the child can even stay in school to get an education. That's sometimes, the very difficult spot in where we're at, in education, in this country, especially in private schools. You'll see that a lot. Sometimes in charter schools that can be very much exacerbated. We've seen that a lot here in Ohio, which we're saturated, particularly in the Dayton area, with charter schools who basically, run themselves, right? They're not held to the same level of standards as a traditional public school. So those are things that I think as parents and as advocates that you really do have to keep in mind. And I'm not saying that to tell you not to stand up for your kid, because you have to. You have to just feel your way through it, and you have to do it in a way, in the best way that you can, that's non-confrontational, right? Just saying, you're communicating, you want to make sure that, everything is okay, and reiterate, right, to the teachers and administrators, that you're there to support your child and that you're there to be a support to them. Like if they have questions, if there's times you can schedule to come up to the school and maybe help out in the classroom. Sometimes it'll take a little bit of that tension away. I've had to do that. Really going above and beyond to make, sort of the teacher in the school too, like feel comfortable that you really are trying to be a partner and not just, right, being, confrontational. One other thing that I think too that's extremely important, especially for Black children, Black girls, we have got to affirm our children. We're living in a very, hostile, political environment right now. I hate to say it, but for Black people, it's been like that for a very long time. So it's really important for parents to reaffirm and give positive affirmations to their children, particularly before school, before walking out the door. Because for some of us, as soon as we walk out the door, sometimes, especially for children who are walkers to school, they're encountering police, they're encountering, if they're living in a neighborhood that is not as safe, there's other things that they're encountering. And so all of those different things impact behavior at school, trauma, right? So we want to make sure that we are, as parents, encouraging positive behaviors, interventions, and supports for our kids in schools. We know that those are the things that work for our kids. It reaffirms them. It lets them know that they're valued. It lets them know that, that they're cared about. All kids need that, right? And that's what we should want all of our schools to be like. We should want positive school climates for all of our children, no matter, what their zip code is, how much money their parents make. It just really should be like that for every single child. And as a parent and as advocates, on this webinar, I think all of us have a responsibility to make sure, that we're supporting each other in that work, but most importantly, supporting the grassroots folks, right? The people who are locally, on the ground, organizing and advocating to push back against these punitive, subjective school discipline policies that really target Black and brown children disproportionately. So those are the things that, that have worked for parents in the Dayton area, working directly with the superintendent, really educating them. We found out in the process, we use data. Ohio, thankfully, collects really good data every year. We know that school districts are required by federal law to report it every 2 years, right? But in Ohio, it's actually required by the Ohio law to report it every year. And Ohio actually disaggregates their data, race, gender. They even use migrant status, socioeconomic status, disability. It's really good data. And so one of the things that, when I was the executive director for Racial Justice Now, we produced a school discipline report card for the entire state of Ohio. And so that was a tool that parents was able to use as well to say, is this, school has a positive school climate for Black children or not, right? So that was a really good tool that parents was able to use. So I think I'm going to open it up or pass it now to back to Adaku. But I hope that I was able to share, some practical tips for advocates and parents to use in their communities, in their local organizing and advocacy work on how to push back on some of these punitive school discipline policies for our children. Thank you.
Thank you, Zakia. I think that we are now going to open it up for Q&A. And Nia, if you're on the line, you can step on and moderate and let us know if you have any questions from our audience.
Great, I do have some questions. So the first one is actually about data. So I'm going to ask Zakia if you could take this first, and then we can maybe hear from Adaku. The first question is, data reporting is often vague and difficult to prove when it's disproportional in its application. Do you have any tips on how to approach data fidelity?
So yeah, I think that's a really good question. I know that we've been questioned about data fidelity. I think that data fidelity is a responsibility of the school district, and as parents, we've taken the approach that, you know, if the school district is reporting the data to the state, then we're going to rely and use that data because it's self-reported, right? And I also think another piece, too, is that you can't just rely on data alone. We also use our own, like, lived experiences. We use our own personal stories. So in the work in Dayton and around the state of Ohio, we use both because we think that both, you know, is really important. You know, you want to use the numbers, you want to use the data, then it's also really important, too, to hear from the people who are actually being directly impacted by these policies. Making sure that, you know, you've got parents up there, you know, describing what it feels like to be called, you know, from work. Some parents have actually lost their jobs. And then also having young people talk about, you know, their experiences and how, you know, they felt, you know, unvalued. So we just think that it's important to use both data and stories.
Yeah, and I would echo Zakia's point about using data with stories because as the audience member pointed out, maybe you don't live in Ohio and so the data isn't as great or as detailed or as accurate. And in those cases, the student voice and parent voice are especially important. And sometimes I feel like you know, data is used, like the fact that we don't have data is used as a crutch. Like the fact that any preschooler is being expelled from preschool, if it's even just one, like I think that's an issue that should be addressed. And so that's how I would recommend kind of going, resolving issues with data fidelity to amplify stories and amplify student and parent voice.
Great, thanks. So our second question is, out of all of the schools, how many schools treat girls poorly? And I guess I'm also curious to hear where are the hot spots and where have you all seen trends when it comes to girls being mistreated or disciplined more severely than their peers?
Yeah, so generally this is an issue that is we see disproportionate discipline, not only in schools where there's a high concentration of Black and brown students, but also in schools where there's like just a significant portion, so like majority white school districts where there is a sizable Black and brown student population. So of course, you know, in school districts when there's not a lot of Black or brown children, we don't really see that much disproportionate discipline, but in places in the South, you know, where there's high number of Black students, we see that. And for Native American students, places like Alaska and the Dakotas, where there's high proportions of Native American students, we see disproportionate discipline. So it's kind of all over the place, all over the map, but we see that it's consistent even in schools that are like majority Black and brown, as well as schools where there's a sizable white population. And we'll be releasing data later this year that kind of shines light on where, like a heat map that shows like where districts have disproportionate discipline. So there will be more information coming soon, so stay tuned.
Great. So the next question that I will put forward is, what are some alternatives to suspensions and expulsions?
So yeah, this is Zakia. So there are a number of evidence-based alternatives, positive alternatives to suspensions and expulsions. So trauma-informed care is something that we believe that is extremely important. Restorative practices, restorative justice is important. Making sure that there's always the relationship building aspect with teachers and families and students, rebuilding of relationships when there has been an infraction, like the suggestion that I had made earlier in the presentation. If there's some peer-to-peer conflict, depending on what it is, obviously, right, you want to make sure that you're mending those relationships and teaching young people how to value each other and not fighting and hurting one another. Positive behaviors, interventions, and supports. There's so many different things that can happen. One of the things that we find as the biggest barrier, not just here in Ohio, but even within the Dignity in Schools campaign, we have members all over the country. We have over 112 members in 27 states, and one of the things that we hear all the time is there's just really a lack of willingness, right, to change the philosophy of how they discipline Black and brown children. There's this historically rooted idea that Black and brown children, people, right, have to be socially controlled in the most punitive ways. And so that is what we're really pushing back against in our local communities, just as a national campaign, is trying to really change hearts and minds around how to look at, instead of dehumanizing Black and brown children, right, to actually see them as children.
Yeah, and I just want to add really quickly to Zakia's point about this idea that Black and brown children need like greater discipline. I think one thing that will get to the heart of that is, implicit bias training for teachers and administrators to allow them to figure out what biases they're bringing into the classroom. We all have implicit biases, but once you're trained to recognize them, you will be able to challenge them in your classroom and how you discipline students. So that's another thing that we would recommend, in addition to positive behavior intervention supports, trauma-informed care, and restorative justice.
Great. So we only have time for one more question. I'm seeing a few coming in, so we might do two more. But I do have a question here, and it says, what do you say to people who want to blame high rates of discipline on parents or poverty?
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, we see that all the time. Again, coming, to this national position as a parent organizer, much of my work before, again, was challenging the stereotypes of Black women, single Black moms, right? And even Black fathers, Black, parents. It's challenging this notion that we don't care about our kids, we just don't show up. What people don't see, and what we've encouraged, parents to, again, come out of the shadows of shame around poverty is that, yeah, that's a reality, right? Poverty is a reality for many parents, not all parents, but that's not an excuse for us to dehumanize them. Instead, we should be figuring out ways how to even be more supportive of those families instead of using it as an excuse to dehumanize them. Many parents are working, sort of these low-wage jobs without a whole lot of protections, so they can't come to the school all the time when some principal or teacher calls. Like, that's just not the reality that they live in. If they miss work, that can mean food not on the table if they lose their job. So like that's reality for many parents. So there's other, you know, things that may be preventing the type of quote unquote involvement that the school district feels that a parent should need, right? Is mostly, you know, sort of on this notion of middle class parents, you know, who may have more protection, you know, on their job, or may have a job that's flexible or something where they can just leave at the drop of a dime, right? That's just not the reality for many, many parents, and so it should not be used as an excuse. I've not met any parents who do not love their children, who do not want the best, the absolute best for their children. I think it's, you know, incumbent on the school district, you know, on the adults and professionals within the school to value every single parent. Again, as I stated before, evaluating those families and parents despite, you know, whatever their income is and whatever their zip code is. That's just that really is how we should really be dealing with our school districts and making sure we're pushing for that kind of customer service, right, from the taxpayers of that local school district.
Okay, great. We have time for one more question. And Zakiya, I'm curious if you have this experience. We have a question that says, do you have any ideas about how to deal with discipline committees who are made up of administrators who arbitrarily toss students from school in the name of safety?
Yes, actually, I have a lot of experience. I am on the policy committee for Dayton Public Schools here in Ohio and on the Student Code of Conduct Committee for Dayton Public Schools. And so the very first couple years of doing that job was, yeah, pushing back on, you know, the district lawyers and even some of the administrators. Again, it was about basically providing them a different education. The lawyers and administrators, you know, usually, you know, fall back on, well, if we don't do the most punitive thing, then we're likely to get sued, or, you know, that's just the excuse. But I think that one of the things that we were able to do, again, was to exploit the fact that, at least here in Ohio, the law is vague and the law does not prescribe, you know, what needs to be done, and that we made the suggestion that, sure, okay, zero tolerance for disruptive behavior. Let's form some restorative justice circles and hire some restorative justice coordinators in the school to help work with students who may be having disruptive behavior, right? And so the district actually responded. They responded to the tune of funding restorative justice coordinators in 10 schools at the tune of $400,000. So parents do have the power. Parents do have the power to, you know, sit on those committees. They should ask to be a part of those committees. They should even advocate for students to be a part of those committees, because there should be parent and student voice at all of those levels of committees where those kinds of decisions will be directly impacting them. So I definitely encourage people who are listening to this to look into how do you get on your local school board's policy committee for the district, and how do you get on the Student Code of Conduct Committee. And one final thing that I'll leave is that in ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act, which is the new federal law, education law that we are all under now, and that many states are forming their plans, the law requires that parents be a part of the process, okay? There is a part of the law that actually requires that. So I can't, you know, state it enough that as parents, not only do you have the right, but you have the responsibility to say, hey, you know, I want to be on this committee. I want to be a part of the team. I think I have a lot to add. And then also push for young people, students themselves, to be a part of those committees. I think that's extremely important to be at the table to help, you know, push those administrators to think deeply and different.
Great. Thank you so much, Zakiya. We're out of time, but I want to thank the two panelists so much for sharing their expertise and giving us all fantastic tips that we can use in our communities. I also want to thank everyone who tuned in. This will be the first of many conversations like this. But in the meantime, This webinar was recorded, so I will be sending the recording and the PowerPoint slides to everyone who registered in the next few days. So again, thank you so much for joining us, and we can't wait for the next conversation. Have a great day.
Thank you.